Well, hello everyone, it's John Loughlin here. I'm the director of FVD International, Forum for Democracy International. I'm delighted to welcome my usual two co-hosts, Peter Lavelle and Jeremy Nell, Germ from South Africa, and our main guest today, Carl Benjamin from Swindon, I believe. Carl, you've been a friend of FVD. You came to speak at an event they held on the beach at Scheveningen in The Hague last summer, if I remember correctly. You've kindly agreed to speak to us about the rape scandal, the grooming gang scandals. But I hope you won't mind if we extend the discussion to include another issue, which I'm sure you'll agree is related, and that is, of course, the Southport murders and the reaction to that. And indeed, these two stories, on the one hand, these rape gangs, these grooming gangs, and on the other hand, this horrible incident in Southport last summer, they have themselves produced, haven't they, a story within a story, because we have, of course, Keir Starmer's reaction to both these events, very violent reaction to the people who protested after the Southport murders, very brutal, followed, of course, by prosecutions and convictions for various tweets. And then the whole issue of, was there a cover-up? And the cover-up also brings us to the grooming scandal, because a week or 10 days ago, there was a call for a national inquiry which reached the House of Commons and which was rejected very firmly by the ruling regime, by the Labour regime in Britain. Perhaps we could start, Carl, by perhaps you could answer the following factual question. When the issue of the grooming gangs blew up again about a week or 10 days ago, things have moved on now a little bit because of the Trump inauguration and all the rest of it. And by the way, I forgot to mention, of course, Elon Musk, as we know, has waded in, adding a further level to this whole story. But when the grooming gang scandal blew up 10 days ago or so, 2 weeks ago, why did it blow up again? What actually happened? Because we'd known about these grooming gangs for years. What was it that triggered a new fever of outrage about this issue, Carl?
I believe the original source of the explosion of it back into the media at the beginning of this year came from an anonymous Twitter account called Max Tempers, because he has, whoever is operating that account, I don't know who it is, has been for years now posting excerpts from transcripts of trials and from various other sources where the grooming gang members themselves, well, we know why they do what they do, and we know their kind of opinion on the British people, the sort of native white English of England. And one of these posts had somehow blown up and was drawn to the attention of Elon Musk, who was then inundated by lots of right-wing accounts, myself included, to inform him that, by the way, this is a long-standing issue. This has been something that has been definitely covered up, but also in a way kind of siloed by the media, the mainstream, and the political establishment, because essentially they're all basically complicit with it. And because they're in Britain, there is a surprisingly tight stranglehold on mainstream discourse by the powers that be. You'll see today that Axel Rudabukana is being called the Amazon killer, as if Amazon is somehow complicit in his crime, all of the front pages. And they do this for a couple of reasons. The first is that they know that people only read the headlines. Most people don't actually read the paper, but they do see them on the newsstands as they're walking past them. So this is a way of inserting this kind of meme into the mind of the person who doesn't really know anything about the subject and isn't really interested in following it. And then they have a very tightly curated set of guests on certain programs, and I'll say the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, so especially BBC Question Time. So you have a very, very tightly curated media environment, and it's not that alternative media doesn't exist, and it's not that we don't have an effect, but they bring the wagons together, circle the wagons very, very, very quickly whenever they feel that something's happening. And so you'll see the Telegraph the other day accusing Elon Musk of being a Nazi because he was being overly exuberant on stage with Donald Trump, and is what they might call neurodivergent. And I think that he was just having trouble expressing himself, actually. But the Telegraph, purportedly a right-wing paper, joined in calling him a Nazi. The Daily Mail often joins in left-wing cancel culture. For example, the Daily Mail have got nothing good to say about Tommy Robinson, even though he has done nothing that would put him outside of the bounds of this discourse in his public life. All of their complaints about him are ancillary, unrelated legal concerns that he's been punished for. So, this is a way of stigmatizing him and drawing him out and sidelining him out of the discourse. And so they I guess you could just call this the Overton window, is very tightly policed in this country. And so they can effectively keep the content mill going and keep the new story, oh, that's the old story, don't worry, it's going to be dealt with. It's out of your mind, it's out of sight. And this is a powerful mechanism of control of the British public.
Carl, you mentioned the Overton window. Is this what this is about? Because this is a story that we are all aware of. I mean, this is what, 10 years ago.
Well, let me finish what I was
my point is that it is the ability to maintain the Overton window. This is an example where they're going to die on this hill and saying, no, we will be able to determine what the discourse is. It's almost as if it's a challenge.
Well, absolutely. That's certainly one of the reasons that they do it, and they realize that their control is predicated on this. And so Elon Musk blowing this issue into the American consciousness has really knocked them for six, because they may well be in tight control of the locus of discourse, or the sort of thing that's dangled in front of people's faces in Britain, but they're not in control of Elon Musk. And having 200 million Twitter followers, or however many he's got now, that puts him far beyond their control. And so if Elon Musk wants to spend upwards of a week or so just repeatedly hammering the point, then that's hundreds of millions of people. And then the knock-on effect is that's thousands of different articles talking about this all around the world. And so suddenly the MAGA right-wing commentariat and public in the United States, who otherwise didn't realize this was something that was going on, got to learn about this in very short order. In Britain, this has been the sort of thing that's been trickling out for decades. Like you say, we've been well aware of this for a long time, but it's been kept on the fringes as if this was something that was unacceptable to talk about in dinner parties on the Westminster circuit. And so it's been kept out of sight and out of mind. And Elon Musk has slapped it firmly on the table in front of everyone and said, no, this is evil and has to stop. And so they've been scurrying to try and figure out what it is they're going to do. Of course, the Conservatives presented, well, could we have a national grooming gang inquiry? Now, there are lots of questions. Do we need another inquiry? Don't we actually know what's going on? And the answer to those is yes, of course we know what's going on, and we actually know the people involved, and some of them have been to jail, but there are at the moment tens of thousands of rapists of children just wandering free in Britain at the moment, because only the ringleaders of the gangs have been arrested. But the Oldham Council, the Council of Oldham, which yet another place where grooming gangs were operating, or rape gangs were operating, requested an inquiry from the government. And of course, Jess Phillips, the Minister for Safeguarding Women, decided that she'd refuse that, probably out of laziness, but also probably just to make sure that it wasn't something that was going to kind of smear the Labour government. If it becomes an increasingly bigger problem, the more involvement they have in this. And so she gave the excuse, well, there were local investigations in these councils and 8 people there went to jail, so that's that problem solved. And so she kicked it back to them, but they had requested it for a reason. And one of the reasons is that in many cases, councillors themselves are involved in either covering it up, pushing it under the table or have personally been involved, as well as some police officers. So to allow them to just mark their own homework, as it were, probably isn't wise when you are looking for justice for some of the most abused people in our society. And so what Elon Musk is a tremendous service. What he did is shoot this into orbit way above their heads, make it an international issue, and so has forced them to agree to do something about it. So as I understand it, I think they are going to do a national inquiry. I think the pressure has built sufficiently, but it's been a bit difficult to follow it in the past couple of days because, of course, the Trump inauguration. So, it is something is happening with it. So, if Elon Musk ever watches this, thank you so much for doing this. Something is going to happen. Now, what they're going to try and do is essentially make it go away, because essentially underneath this issue are much deeper questions about the nature of the multicultural state and the nature of what it is that we can and can't discuss about this and how this problem can be solved. I don't know how deeply you want to delve into those, because honestly, they're difficult, and the legality of talking about them is tricky.
We do want to delve into that. I can confirm, by the way, to our viewers, that what you say about the mainstream media is true, Carl. I live in France, as you know, and when this blew up, thanks to Elon Musk, as you've now very well explained, the trials were going on in the south of France of a man who invited his friends round to rape his wife, who was drugged. The Mazon rape trials. They were given saturation coverage. These Mazon rape trials by The Guardian. And there was a lot of typical Guardian, crocodile tears about France having to face up to this or that. And meanwhile, of course, the grooming gang scandal was completely passed over in silence, even though, of course, it's a British newspaper. But the thing about the inquiry, I thought that they had rejected it on a 3-line whip, in fact, that the government had forced its members of parliament to vote against it. So I'm intrigued to hear that you say that they are going to have one after all. But I was absolutely mystified.
Sorry, just to interrupt on that. Yeah, they did in Parliament when the Conservatives forced a vote for purely partisan reasons. But since then, various members of the Starmer government have come out, and I think it was Yvette Cooper who did announce the other day that she was going to hold one because the public pressure has just been too great. So there's been a distinct aspect of partisanship to this as well, which is actually quite disgusting, because this is really an issue that everyone should be able to agree upon. But sorry to interrupt. Please carry on.
No, but I mean, the whole idea that you would not have an inquiry is unbelievable, given the history of judicial inquiries in Britain. Inquiries, you just get some compliant judge to sit in a committee room. We've just had the ridiculous Dawn Sturgis inquiry. One's memory goes back to the David. What was he called? The scientist, the Iraq scientist. Oh dear, I've had a memory lapse. Anyway, these inquiries, Lord Hutton's inquiry into the sexed up Iraq dossier, these things are exactly the way to bury something. So how can we possibly understand this resistance to having an inquiry? Surely that would be the best way to shut everyone up.
I think that they're worried about social media, and they're worried that what will come out of it is Labour complicity. Now, like you say, it would be the easiest thing in the world for them to put a news article on page 5 of the BBC's website, and no one will ever see it. 3,000 people maybe in the entire country would see it, and then they would have done their reporting, and it would just flow away into the slurry of the daily news. But I think what they're afraid of is that actually someone like Mr. Tempers on Twitter will clip the relevant bits that show they are not just complicit, but honestly, in some ways, the architects of these gangs, and he will blow that into orbit. And of course, he can then take that to Donald Trump, who I'm sure is actually not really very favorable to the Labour Party, the current ruling party of this country, being the architects and complicit with these gangs. And this would make Keir Starmer's life very difficult, I'm sure. So I think that's the reason.
Well, Carl, I mean, so they're all afraid of what's going to come out. They're all afraid of what they have covered up. But you already kind of dangled the most important issue in front of us. I mean, what does this say about multiculturalism in the UK and in the West in general? Because that's what we're going to be faced with. That's the cold reality that we've seen people shove under the rug time after time. You're willing to sacrifice your own culture and dignity. You sacrifice your own children because of some kind of ideological feeling of supremacy. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. This is not like, a Bitcoin scam. I mean, this is the rape of children. Carl.
I'm sorry, I've lost you.
Okay, and I think we lost John also here. Okay, just real briefly. I mean, what you're telling us is that there's
quite quiet.
Can you hear me now, Carl? Can you hear me now? Okay, yeah. So you're saying that there is culpability all around. That's one of the reasons, one of the many reasons for hesitation here. But ultimately, what's at stake here is a damning review of multiculturalism in the UK and in the Western world in general. And that is a conversation that we obviously know they do not want to have, because we all know they're on the losing side of the argument.
Yeah, the inevitable conclusion that I think that the public has already reached is that actually multiculturalism was a way of victimizing them, and this was done deliberately. And we know from, for example, one of Tony Blair's advisors in 2009 said that we were going to rub diversity in the right's nose, and various other just offhand comments that they've made over the years that indicate that this is a way of kind of punishing the British people for some reason. And well, that's clearly happened. And now that they've brought these people here, they've decided that they need to instantiate a kind of moral order in which no one community has any favor above any others, allegedly. And what this means is taking account the relative, what they would say is power dynamics between the communities. Now, this isn't an accurate description of anything, but they look at the raw numbers of these communities and say, well, there are 5 million Pakistanis and 45 million English, therefore 40 million English, therefore through leftist, the magic of leftist calculation, the thumb needs to be put on the scales to make sure that the English are kept down and the Pakistanis are not, and they're given various kind of privileges.
Morality is a mathematical equation?
In their view, yes. In their view. And this was something that was very poorly challenged by the right when it began in the early 2000s, and carried on under various conservative governments. For some reason, they didn't decide to reset the scales and judge people based on the content of their character. And so now we have a position where no one is allowed to say it, but there is I have to word what I want to say very carefully. There is a moral debt that is incurred, and it's not on an individual level at this point. It's on a collective level. And of course, this is a very difficult thing for the multicultural liberal elites to firstly admit and then deal with. And so they live in a constant state of crisis where every time something happens to the English community by one of the foreign communities that they've brought to live among us, and if you want to look at you can look at the crime statistics in your own time, but of course they are disproportionately represented in these crimes. That's another weight that goes on one side of the scale that is not being balanced out by justice on the other. And people remember that this is happening. People know that this is happening. And so when you get polls asking people about the favorability rate, how they feel about the communities that live among them. And the communities that have incurred a moral debt are, of course, widely despised. And the moral debt is continuing to mount up.
Carl,
And
what
this
is the sorry?
It's possibly illegal to even talk about. The nature of characterization is what is at stake here. Are we allowed to characterize the community as having this moral burden? And the answer is, of course, no. But that doesn't get rid of the moral burden that the community itself has incurred. But you'll notice on the other side of the aisle, of course, when we're talking about the moral debt the British have to the Indians or something like that for colonialism, that's a very easy thing for us to talk about. But we are not allowed to talk about any moral debts that minority communities incur because of this left-wing power dynamic framework.
Well, you know, states can have debts to other states. Okay, you know, the sins of imperialism. That's, you know, I know that very well. But trying to equate that with communities within the UK is just pure nonsense. Okay, there's no logical connection.
No, I'm sorry. It's no. It's not pure nonsense. The knowledge of the gangs is widespread in this community. Right? They all know. They all know. And we know from various testimonies from the victims and the perpetrators that there is an aspect of racial supremacy in the gangs, ethno-religious
This is my
in
point.
the gangs.
We're agreeing.
Hang on. The act of the gangs is itself a political act, and it's being done consciously as a political action by this community, and that's why it's not inappropriate to make the comparison. But also, the comparison is not made between the British state and the Indian state. It is always made between the British people and the Indian people. And so what I think that our liberal elites failed to understand is that while they may have thought that they have essentially liberated themselves from carrying the collective moral burden of colonialism, the people who we had previously colonized don't feel that they have had that lifted from them and are carrying it with them when they come to this country.
Well, this apologist position undermines the whole nature of citizenship then, okay? And that's one objection that I would have. Anyway, Jeremy wanted to jump in.
I just want to say, I don't think I'm apologizing for anything. I think I'm accurately describing what's happening.
Oh, you're describing it. Yeah, I get it.
Carl,
No, I'm not trying to be confrontational, but I appreciate that in the Western liberal political tradition, this is a very uncomfortable set of things I'm laying out, and I'm trying to be very delicate with it. And it took me many years to be able to see it myself. But I genuinely think that is what is happening in the minds of the perpetrators. These people hold a collective sense of political, the politicization of their own community is on an individual, personal, and collective level. Whereas for Westerners, the English-speaking Westerners, we often think of ourselves as individuated and not responsible for something someone else has done. But actually, that's a parochial view that Western English-speaking people have, and it's not universally shared. And in these communities, it's definitely not universally shared. And so that does undermine our concept of individual rights and citizenship. That is true. But that is still the reality of what is happening, I think. And this is why I think the liberal state just does not know what to do. And they're so worried about ethnic violence breaking out.
Yeah, Carl, so I, as you know, am in South Africa, and I reckon that we are about 20 years ahead of where you are in the UK, right? So I can tell you right now that we are a multicultural mess, and we are a great example of what not to do. And looking at the trajectory, it's very difficult to see a direction that is not heading our way on your side of the world. But my question then is, what is the solution?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not saying I have a solution. I think the first thing that the British state should do is just cease immigration, at least from certain areas of the world. If we'd shown any level of discernment in our immigration policy, then of course we wouldn't have the problems that we have now, but we haven't. We've had a very liberal, universal immigration policy, where it's just been assumed that every person on Earth is exactly like every other person on Earth, and eventually they would just become exactly like us, which turns out is just not the case. So the first thing we ought to do on the social level to deal with, to be able to start coming to grips with these problems, is definitely stop the inflow of these kinds of people. But the problem is not just those kinds of people. There are other problems from other immigrant groups that is not, and it's not even necessarily about the groups either. In many ways, it's about the numbers of people who are allowed to come here. For example, I live in Swindon, which is just a fairly large but just very middling English town, which is why I liked it up until about 5 or 6 years ago, just before COVID, in fact. It was very, well, homogeneously English. Now, the centre of town has been, all I can say is colonized by what I would describe as global nomads. These people aren't Islamists or anything like that. They're not from any one community themselves. So there's no organized community action or sense of resentment even, actually, from these people. But what there are people from just all over the world in very large numbers who have been brought to occupy my town. And so it's very peculiar walking down the main high street of Swindon, because you hear South Americans, you hear North Africans speaking French, you hear, of course, Bangladeshis, Indians, Pakistanis. There are also East Asians, there are Africans, and they're like, it's almost like they're tourists, right? But you wouldn't become a tourist to Swindon because there's just nothing here to see. But it's almost like they're tourists. But I know that they don't have jobs, because every day they're just stood around town wearing nice new clothes and drinking tea in the coffee shops and just leisurely wandering around as if they don't have a care in the world. So I know many of them are on benefits. I know I'm paying for them to be here. And this is another aspect of immigration that is just causing massive feelings of alienation in the British public. And I know, because I speak to lots of people about this, and everyone just looks at the country and says, well, what is happening? Why is this happening to us? And so not only are there communities that have incurred a moral debt, but there are people who themselves probably can't explain why they're here. You know, I know when that chap from Morocco was in his village in Morocco, he'd never heard of the town of Swindon. So how did he arrive here? How did he end up here? Someone must have put him here. Someone must be responsible for that. And so this is a massive problem with immigration in England generally. So the first thing to do would be to just cease the inflow. The second thing to do would be to deport the quote-unquote refugees. Now, almost all of our refugees, according to the government figures, 90% of the people who have come across the English Channel on small boats, dinghies mostly, have been young men. You can see the pictures of them crossing for yourself. They young men between 20 and 30 mostly. Very rarely you'll see a woman or a child among them. And they're being put in hotels for us to pay for, and then given a weekly stipend for some reason from the British taxpayer. They should all be deported, obviously, back to the countries of origin. But then the real question is not so. I mean, these are fairly self-evident policy suggestions that a government that was interested in the health of the country would just implement. They would just, well, okay, this has been bad for everyone. And not only has it been bad, it's not what people have ever voted for. So these would be very easy things to do. But the question of, now there are about a quarter of England is non-English at this point. So you can imagine just how many millions of foreigners have been allowed to come and live here. It's been something about 15 million, something like that in total. And the question of how and what to do with that is honestly a very difficult one for them to deal with. I'm not even sure what I can propose legally, but I think possibly some kind of state messaging that would say, and even then you couldn't really do that. It wouldn't be fair to do that, right? Because a lot of these people haven't come here on false pretenses. They've been invited over by the British governments, succeeding British governments, peaking under the Conservatives in 2019, letting in 1 million a year, more than. They've come here on relatively good terms, as in they were just told, look, you can come and work and live in England. So it wouldn't be fair to just say, right now, you just have to leave. We're just going to make you leave. That wouldn't be a good thing to do at all. I think that maybe restricting the benefit system to native-born people only, so you'd have to be born in England to be able to qualify for the benefits and for the NHS, that would probably encourage or incentivize many people to just say, well, okay, well, I'm going to go home then. But honestly, there are no good answers. There are no good answers.
So, Carl, I'm just going to hop on this particular point for a moment. All of your suggestions have been sort of at state level. But what do you think can be done on a community level? And it would almost seem radical to suggest that communities start becoming more sovereign within their own community, so to speak, creating their own digital and theoretical borders of, communities. Is that something you think can or might even become realistic?
Not in the immediate future. England has several disadvantages in dealing with this kind of problem. The first being this is outside of our sphere of experience. We've never had to deal with a tide of immigration of this scale. You will always get some leftist who jumps up and says, well, didn't England take 50,000 Huguenots in 1629 or something like that? And it's like, well, yeah, but 50,000 Protestants is actually a relatively easy thing to integrate. I mean, Nigel Farage is the descendant of a French Protestant 400 years ago. So that's not really the same thing. And even then, I'm sure it caused trouble at the time, but it's a lot less trouble than, 5 million Muslims, people who don't even share the same moral worldview at all. But the problem that England has is there's a remarkable moral unity between the people and the state. The people themselves view themselves as the people who won World War II, and they view World War II as an unvarnished moral crusade to defeat Nazism. And so they view their state as being a part of their national community, not an intrusive part normally, or it never used to be an intrusive part. It was seen as something that was necessary and well regulated and accountable, right, through the democratic process. And so there wasn't a large contingent of people who were actively opposed to the nature of the British state. And in fact, it seemed like one of the best arrangements in the world. Actually, it seemed like, we were always famous for good governance, and this seemed to be a good proof of it until the 20th century. And
I would add to that a patriotism. People don't like the word nationalism, but a good patriotism, a positive one, a very positive message, because of that unity between the state and the individual. And as a matter of fact, I would say for decades that was the gold standard.
I agree. And what this does is it disarms in the sort of way you're talking about, Germ, the moral disarmament of the communities, because wherever you lived in England, you would get different accents, but you would get Englishmen, and you would know the values that they had, and you would know that you'd be the funny guy from the south if I went to the north. But I know exactly how these people are going to react to various things that would happen. I know how they're going to treat me, and they know how I'll treat them. And so it was all, while we had our regional differences, there was the moral unity of the country was very strong, and everyone knew what right from wrong was, and you knew how you were going to be treated. And so there was never a need for a kind of hostile community border, the kind that you get in, say, the Middle East or the subcontinent or in East Asia or something like that. There was never any need, and probably in Africa as well, there was never need for these sharp borders between communities. We don't have the social training to know what we should and should not do in these cases. And so the English are very open to anyone who comes to them. And this is something that has been painful for them. During my MEP campaign in 2019, I interviewed a lady from Hull when I was down in Cornwall. And she said, look, I'm not a racist. I don't really even want to be here, but the Pakistani community in Hull is racist against the English, and they would continually act in a overtly vicious way. They would bully our children. They would throw bricks through our windows. They would be untrustworthy around our girls, and we just had to leave because all of those members of that community are used to how things are back in Pakistan, where you have to tightly patrol the borders of your community to make sure that other people don't take advantage of you. Well, we haven't had that for a very, very long time. And I don't think the English are prepared, frankly. I don't think we've got the kind of politicized consciousness that these communities have of their own social existence in this country. And I think it's going to be difficult for the English to develop that because we are a well-meaning people, right? We don't want to have prejudicial and hostile feelings towards people just because they come from a different group. And that works just fine when you're surrounded by other people who don't have prejudicial and hostile feelings towards you because you're part of another group. I mean, most Europeans or North Americans or South Americans that come to Britain, they're fine. It's totally fine. There's no issues. But you do get those other groups from Asia and Africa often that do have hostile feelings to you because you come from another group, and we're just not well equipped to deal with that. And so no, I don't think that any kind of community sovereignty in this way is on the horizon, frankly. I think that people are still looking to the state as they would have done 20 or 30 years ago. So, okay, well, what are you going to do? But of course you can see Keir Starmer's ham-fisted, mealy-mouthed reaction in response to all of this, which is, I don't know what to do. I'm the avatar of the liberal state. I can't put a moral burden on a particular community and single them out and say, right, you've done wrong. He can't do this. Everyone else is going to do this, whether they like it or not, but he can't. And so we're trapped in this.
Well, Carl, isn't it necessary?
Legacy paradigm at this point? That's the problem.
I mean,
so
isn't it necessary for you to do that? I mean, this is an existential threat. I mean, this is not a question of tastes. I mean, it's a question of to be or not to be. And and my question to you, going back to the rape gangs, I mean, obviously there's an avoidance of this of the people in power because the entire paradigm of neoliberalism will be shown for what it is, and a failure in every single category. Its entire ideological construct has been a failure for just about all of us, maybe not those on the very top. And that's why they don't want to address this. I mean, and what I find really extreme is that some of the most vulnerable people were very much exploited. And even that can't inform you that this is existential. That is a very bad place to be.
Yeah, you are completely correct. It is. And we can already see what the future looks like. All of the largest cities of England, the 5 largest cities of England are now minority English by quite some way in many cases. In the 2021 census, we found that London was 37% English, Luton was 33%, Birmingham is 40%, 45%, something like that. And so, and then when you go to these places, you realize, well, they're just disgraceful. They're run down. They look disgusting. There's rubbish piling up in the streets. Crime is through the roof. There are loads of, like, accidents are much higher. You know, like we just assume everyone drives to the same standard we drive at, and things like this. So you are absolutely right. It is necessary to generate that sort of thing. And actually, raising the kind of parochial consciousness of the English is part of the project of Lotus Eaters. It's very clear this is something we have to do, and this is why I'm speaking, in fact, very clearly in terms of England and the English, because actually our Celtic brothers have got at least a national Celtic identity in their heads. But for the English, this has been something that seeped away over the 20th century, and just to be replaced with the civic identity of British. Because of course, there's no British nation. British is a state, and this is something that is, everyone knows that this is a problem. I mean, Boris Johnson in 2013 tried to emphasize English identity, and even Robert Jenrick only last year got in trouble for saying, well, look, actually English identity is a real thing that we have to talk about, because the English are kind of lost and adrift in this strange sea of competing identities without one of their own, and without English interests, like English interest groups, being able to operate in a multicultural society. Well, we just stand to lose. Like, we've already lost our main cities, we just stand to lose the shires now, which is all we have left. You know, we don't have anywhere else to go, we don't have any more homes. And even now, you will see activist attempts to try and get, well, why don't we try and get Muslims to go and walk in the shires? Why aren't there more black people in the shires walking around the countryside? And they're never going to stop. They don't recognize that this is where the English live and deserve to have a place of their own. And again, this is one of the projects that we have here at Lotus Eaters. It's what I personally talk about quite a lot, because it's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable for the average person to think about, but it's necessary.
Carl, what is English identity?
Well, it's the same as any other identity. So an ethnic identity is literally how you view yourself in relation to other ethnicities. This question often trips people up, because they think, oh, now I have to give an itemized list of things that constitute a particular identity. But that's actually not what an identity is. It's about your personal recognition of yourself in relation to other people. And so you don't actually need an itemized list. You say, well, it's my feeling of my sense of self and my sense of belonging and my sense of place. So you don't need to give any examples or anything like this, because I mean, like John Major, gave the classic example of, it's playing cricket on a village green. Yeah, in many ways that is a quintessentially English thing to do. But if the English stop playing cricket in a village green, well, we don't suddenly stop being English. The sort of more technical answer is it's a very multi-layered thing, in which you are describing a set of you are describing kind of ethnic inheritance. So there is a genetic component to it. You are describing a set of cultural norms, values, and habits that manifest in daily life. You are describing a legal system, a social system, and these are quite distinct when you start drilling down into them as well. You're describing a political culture, and you're describing, of course, the political history of a state that has manifested all over the world. Actually, this spread itself all over the world. So that is what English identity is. But it's all of those things all at the same time.
Yeah, but that's
Carl,
very
I've had
vague.
sorry, go ahead, John. Go ahead.
No, John, we need to hear
John,
from
please.
you. You're back.
No, it's
No, you're
I
back.
don't know what the hell's been going on. I've actually just moved in this rather small room, which seems to have helped. I fear that we've advanced already into much more interesting waters, Carl, thanks to you. But I wanted also, if you haven't done so already while I was absent, to talk about the Southport murders, because when my internet connection started to break off, you began to say two things that I think are absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure it's true, and by the way, I think it's also true of France, where I live, that the British government is terrified of race relations breaking down, of there being riots and so on. And you also mentioned, and then I think the internet cut off, about some level of complicity with the grooming gangs. I don't think I heard your point about that, but what I want to ask you is, what about the Southport murders? Do you accept Keir Starmer's claim that the withholding of information at the time of those murders was necessary to avoid a contempt of court and the collapse of the trial of the murderer? Or do you think that there was perhaps some cover up there also in order to keep the lid on extremely fragile race relations?
I don't know. I'm not a legal expert, but I don't see how naming the suspect puts the trial in jeopardy, nor, in fact, giving basic factual details about the subject. I don't really understand how that would put the trial in jeopardy. And as I understand it, it would have to be the judge who would have to decide that the trial itself has been compromised, and so he would have to throw it out. I would have thought that would have been an extraordinarily high bar in a case like this. I'm actually not really aware of when that has actually happened. I did some Google searching the other day, and I found 4 different cases where it nearly had happened, but it didn't get the case kicked out of court. And these were, in some ways, kind of trivial. So it wouldn't really have mattered whether the case would kicked out of court or not. Where in this case, I don't know, like I said, but it would shock me to see. I mean, I can't even imagine what a judge would be thinking to do that in this kind of case. And so it very much looks to the public, whether this is the case or not, the optics on it are very much that here we have a second generation immigrant young man who has, from what we know now, seemed to have had a history of resentment against the British and festered on this for some reason. He had a violent history in school. He was found with a bunch of books that were deeply critical of Britain and the Empire. And for some reason, he decided that he would attack society itself. So one thing that's interesting about mass attacks that people don't think about in any depth is if, for example, he'd gone and killed his bullies, that would be understandable on a personal level. You would say, okay, obviously you shouldn't kill anyone. But if Jones and Jimmy had been bullying Axel Rudicabana, and Axel takes a knife and goes and kills the pair, well, it's understandable, right? There's a direct personal connection there. He's taking vengeance on people he feels has wronged him, and so it's at least not. It's a human aspect. It's a human thing to do. It's a normal, understandable human thing to do. You could say that he's not a monster, right? You could say he's done wrong. Obviously, you shouldn't kill someone, but you could argue that it was in a fit of passion or something like this. But to a calculated attack on what is essentially an anonymous group of people. So you see this in school shootings or mass shootings in theaters, or like the terror attacks in the Ariana Grande concert, or supermarket malls and stuff like that in America, where they're just attacking society itself. As this thing is a representation and a vulnerable area of society to essentially terrorize the wider society and make it all feel insecure that this could happen any time. Well, that's actually something really different. And that speaks to a kind of a calculated rationale that underpins it. And you can see the fact that he had taken the time to create a ricin, a restricted substance. I don't even know how that's made, but I don't think it's going to be something that's actually really simple to do. I imagine there's a process that you have to go through to make it. And so this was someone who held deep resentments against Britain and England itself, like the wider society. It wasn't a personal issue that he was trying to find some sort of cathartic release over. This was someone who hated.
He had been indoctrinated with woke theories about slavery and all the rest of it.
It does seem that way, yeah. And I don't know what his relation to the Al Qaeda manual is. I know that he had one, but I don't know if that means maybe he was just looking for tactics or something, rather than being a Muslim. But either way, it's not good things. And the thing is, this again, it ties into the question of the multiculturalism, which is, okay, well, what's the multicultural state do when the people that they have brought here decide to harbor deep resentment and hatred against the people among whom they're meant to be a guest, among whom they're meant to be starting to integrate? Like, the ideal for any immigration, and this has been the same all the way through history, is that you marry someone from the group who you've joined. That's the ideal. So then your children are of that group, and so they don't feel like outsiders to it, and they don't end up stewing in this resentful hatred because it's part of themselves. And that essentially should have, I don't know, I mean, like in Paraguay, I think it was in the 19th century, forbade Spaniards from marrying Spaniards. You had to marry a native in Paraguay. Why? Because, of course, it gets rid of the ethnic difference. And so within a generation or two, everyone in Paraguay is of this mixed inheritance, and so that solves that problem. And we've taken absolutely nothing. We've made absolutely no requirements on these people that we've brought here. We've said no, just live as you were living back at home. Just live here, and we'll just stand back and let you do whatever it is you're doing. And it turns out that's actually not good for their mental health, right? I mean, second-generation immigrants are overrepresented in terror attacks in the United Kingdom. Why? Why are they attacking the civilization they've been brought and raised in?
And in France.
Sorry, yeah, not sorry. Essentially, this is a recurring pattern. And so, whatever we assumed was going to be the natural consequence of just bringing these people over, it's obviously wrong. Unless, of course, the purpose of bringing them here was to commit terror attacks, which I'm going to be generous and suggest wasn't actually what they thought would happen. So, the Axel Ruda Cabana case is very similar in these ways to the other kinds of problems that we've had. And once again, you can see they just don't know what they're going to do about it. The nudge units and the controlled spontaneity of trying to pin this on Amazon is disgusting. The front pages of the newspaper today, all of them, the Amazon killer, as if Amazon had anything to do with this. Like, I assume that he ordered a kitchen knife off Amazon, which is why they've done that. I haven't actually had time to look into it. It's all very breaking.
Yeah, that is what they're saying. Yeah.
Well,
yeah, so, I mean, that's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
Carl, even in our conversation here, and unfortunately John wasn't with us the whole time, I see, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I see hesitation in what you want to say. You're like careful, you're very careful. I mean, that's, for me, that is very emblematic of the whole problem here. I mean, you can't even really talk about it. We'll talk about it, but we won't talk about it. I mean, that's the problem. And this is representative of all the things that you've just said here. You know, I find that really, really disturbing.
I don't live in a free country. I'm currently bound by Section 127 of the Communications Act of 2003, I think it was. If I send something that can be deemed as grossly offensive, well, I can go to jail. And every year, thousands of British people go to jail over offensive communications that someone has reported to the government, and the government has said, yep, that's good enough for...
That's very anti-English. Okay, I can tell you, you were asked what does it mean to be English? That's anti-English. Okay,
I completely agree with you, but I have to be realistic about the occupation, the current moral order that occupies England at the moment. It's very much an anti-English globalist occupation. But these are the laws, and they will come and get me if I do something wrong. So I have to be very careful.
Carl, do you think the entire conversation that we're chatting about, which hinges on multiculturalism, is in any way linked to the restrictions on your speech?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the main concerns, one of the reasons that we have so many different, and we've got layers of legislation that are designed to catch this kind of thing. So you can say something offensive on social media, but you could also be discriminating based on race or gender or something, blah, 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 blah. You know, various identity categories in the workplace, or you could be caught in public saying something to someone else. So you're not using a communications platform. And this would fall afoul of a different kind of hate speech law in order to prevent negative characterization of groups. That's the entire purpose of this. You are not allowed to characterize groups in a way that group might find offensive. And that they think, the rationale for this underpins this, they think that community strife, that race relations, tensions, and things like this all begin in the conceptualization of the group as being negative, which in some way, yes, that might be true. And so they think that they're preventing that by censoring and persecuting people who dare to characterize groups. And this is Tommy Robinson's great crime, the characterization of one particular community in a certain way. Whether it's true or not, the truth of the statement is irrelevant as far as they're concerned. This is a moral injunction that the liberal order has placed upon us. We have to only speak about active individuals involved in things. Even though 50 different towns and cities across England, this grooming gang phenomena has occurred in, it is not unreasonable to make generalizations in those cases. But legally, we're in a very difficult position. And they seem to think that the acts themselves are done in isolation, right? They seem to think that if they just prevent discourse on the subject, then the people who are at the sharp end of the negative acts will receive them in isolation and say, well, it's just that chap or those chaps who are raping my daughter, and it's got nothing to do with the rest of them, and therefore that person won't have a prejudice against the entire group. But of course, that's just not how human beings work. And so this is why there's this building pressure in England, and this is why the riots happened at Southport. It is true that they didn't know the characteristics of the man who'd committed the attack, and they went to Muslims and mosques and assumed that this was an Islamic terror attack because we've had so many of them, and because
which it was.
We actually still don't know that he was a Muslim. We do know that he's
exercising my freedom of speech here. Okay, that's how I would. I don't want to put my views on anyone here. I'm speaking for myself. I don't want to put you in jail. Sorry.
No. Well, if it doesn't come out of my mouth, I should be okay. Which is why it's been very heartening to see well-meaning Americans exercising their freedom of speech.
I live in Russia. Okay.
So you live where?
I live in Russia. Okay.
And the
multiculturalism here, we could all reconvene at another time, and I can tell you how it works here and the problems that they have avoided. They still have some problems here, but not nearly the magnitude of South Africa, France.
Well, we have freedom of speech, but only by virtue of the fact that we have an ineffective government.
Yeah. The problem is we haven't actually got a highly efficient state. State apparatus very much focused on these kind of dissidents, and so yeah, I do appreciate the Americans, and lots of Americans have been coming to our defense in a way that they just can't is untouchable. But for us in England, we have to be careful.
It's unfathomable for me. It doesn't compute. It doesn't. It doesn't make any sense.
I've been ringing the alarm about this since at least like 2014, saying, look, this is a tyrannical state we're living in, and this is not the way that England should be governed. But of course, that's why I'm on the outside of their discourse.
Well, what's really interesting, Carl, is that about offending people. Well, from what I know about Jeremy and John and I have been friends for a long time. I can say, and I'm sure we can throw you into the mix as well, we're offended all of the time, 24/7, by what people say, all of the time. But I don't resort to violence. I don't resort to bullying. I resort to ideas, okay? And that is even not permitted anymore, okay? Because speech is violence. Whoever came up with that should be shot, sorry, okay? Metaphorically, of course, okay?
Hard to disagree.
Yeah, Carl just stays quiet.
If you lose speech, if you lose speech, you lose everything. Everything else is ancillary to speech.
It's the metaphorical bullet, Peter.
I completely. You're preaching to the choir. I swear to God. But the politicians in this country don't care or don't believe that, and they have the system sewn up at the moment. This is why, despite his flaws, I would like to see Nigel Farage win. I would like to see Nigel Farage at least defeat the two parties, because I mean he's not perfect or anything like that, but he's not someone who is pro this censorious regime. Right? It's conceivable that if Nigel Farage were to win a majority in Parliament and become Prime Minister, which honestly, the way the polls are going, is not looking that far off actually, and he's starting to look somewhat of an inevitability at this point. It's certainly conceivable that Nigel Farage would remove and repeal a lot of this legislation that puts people in jail for the things that they say. It's entirely conceivable that he would do that. I don't think he'd go very far on many of the issues that we need to address, but I think on that issue, I think he could be persuaded to actually do something about it.
I see that time is against us, and John has what appears to be disappeared. Oh, is John back? John, you can take the reins. I don't know if John can hear me. John, can you hear me?
Okay, Jeremy, I think you're going to have to wrap it up. Okay.
All right. So John can't hear me. Okay. Carl Benjamin, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. I know that John normally wraps these things up, but it appears that his connection. Oh, can John hear me now? No, he can't.
Absolutely can't.
All right, let me just do it on behalf of you, John. So, on behalf of the Forum for Democracy International, John Lauchland, Peter Lavelle
I'm really sorry.
in Russia.
I'm going to have to watch this, as I hope you'll hear me. Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me?
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Carl.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Carl.
I hope this is useful.
Thanks, Vincent.
Thanks, Vince.